shocking, it's barbaric, it is primitive, it's ghastly. They've already beheaded 3 hostages, including 2 Americans, and the Muslim monsters of ISIS are threatening to murder more. But what are their long-term goals? Jay Sekulow, interestingly enough, has written a new book telling us the chilling details. It's called The Rise of ISIS, a threat we can't ignore. And Jay's with us right now. Jay.
Hey, Pat. Good to see you again.
Bless you. Hey, how come you started studying this ISIS thing? Where'd you come on to it?
Well, you know, we have the office in Jerusalem, and we do a lot of work in the Middle East. And I started looking at what the next wave of terror really was going to be. And we were at Oxford this summer and had this program dealing with terror groups. And the ISIS thing was just starting to get in the news. So we'd done a series of papers, me, Skip Ash, a number of us from our offices here. And we presented these papers. And by the end of the program, the entire topic discussion was on the extent and significance of what was then called, they were calling themselves the Islamic State now. It was then called ISIS and ISIL, you'll hear. But we realized that this was a group that had the lethality that al-Qaeda has never had, the troops that al-Qaeda had never had, the landmass that al-Qaeda never had, and the money. That al-Qaeda had money, but not like this. They are operating, you know, the president wants to ignore the fact that he says, well, it's not a nation state. Well, in reality, they're operating like one. And the growth of it is so significant in such a relatively short time. And it was AQI, was al-Qaeda in Iraq, was ISIS. And they were so brutal, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, that Osama bin Laden kicked him out. That's how bad this group is. And they are on the march, and we are in their sights. The United States is not immune from this. They have got agents everywhere. And as we've looked at it, we think that this is a threat that if we ignore, we're ignoring it at our own peril.
What are their goals? What do they want to do?
It's the establishment. I mean, he's done it in a sense, and that is the establishment of the caliphate. So Abu Bakr becomes Caliph Ibrahim. He changes the name initially from the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq to the Islamic State in Syria and the Levant. That's the greater Middle East. Now it's just the Islamic State. So it is the establishment of the caliph, the caliphate, and basically the application of Sharia under the banner. They said they're going to raise the flag of ISIS over the White House. They mean that. I mean, this is not something we can ignore. They mean it. And the reality is, it is such a significant danger to the United States. I think it impacts everything else that's going on in the Middle East and the rest of the world. And we're looking, you know, when you had the Hamas conflict with Gaza and Gaza with Israel this last time, people were ignoring ISIS. And they were focusing on this. The lethality that ISIS has, Pat, I don't think we can even imagine right now.
Why has the president been so cautious? He said we're going to degrade them and all this kind of stuff. You got to kill them, don't you?
Because he thinks it's a manageable threat. And when we wrote Rise of ISIS, to deal with exactly that point, because the reality is 2 things the president said which are telling. Number 1, it's not Islamic. Tell that to Caliph Ibrahim that it's not Islamic, because he sure thinks it's Islamic. Okay, that's number 1. And so do the 31,000 fighters, number 1. Number 2, that you can't manage this. You can't negotiate with this. When we were at Oxford this summer, one of the heads of the program that we're involved in, who's a pretty much an appeasement guy, let's get along and, you know, kind of work things out. He said, crush them. Now, this is an Oxford professor, expert on the Middle East, who said they have to be crushed. So when you've got the left acknowledging that, so the president's hesitancy to engage this is mind-boggling, but it's, again, I think he's protecting his view of the Middle East.
Those guys are running around in pickup trucks with machine guns on them. We could have stopped it pretty quickly if we moved in with force, couldn't we?
Yes, or if we kept a status of force agreement in Iraq in the first place, and none of this would have happened. This was so preventable. But you know, Pat, the president has a narrative. You've talked about this so eloquently on the broadcast. The president has a narrative for the Middle East, and none of this is playing into his narrative. He has backed every wrong side of every leader in the Middle East, including the Muslim Brotherhood, who Egypt is now outlawed.
That's right.
So he's backing them. That's why when he says we're going to work with the Syrian rebels, who are these rebels? I'll tell you who they are. The rebels are the ones that sold Steve Saltloff to ISIS for $25,000 or $50,000, and he ended up getting beheaded. So I think I don't even want to say a naive policy. The president has a narrative out there, but when you start saying it's not Islamic, you're ignoring the reality of it. It's certainly their view of Islam.
What are we going to do? What can anybody do? I mean, you've got this guy in the White House who controls foreign policy, and he's just a total screw-up. Well, what is it?
Well, I think when we heard David Cameron make that unbelievable speech that we're going to end this, we're going to stop this, and then the president comes out and says, we don't have a strategy to deal with this. You know what I said? I said, you know, if you don't have a strategy, you're scaring everybody. Certainly not the terrorists, but you're scaring the rest of the free world. If you don't have a strategy, find one. Don't go up to the presidential podium and say we don't have a strategy yet. We're not putting the cart before the horse. ISIS is not new. They've been around for a couple of years. They're just now stronger than ever, and lack of leadership has allowed it.
He made a speech to the American public, but he didn't really address what he was going to do for sure.
Except he's not going to send ground troops, and he's going to do the containment, and we're going to eventually eliminate this cancer. And then he initially said, as you said, manage this. This is not ISIS is not a manageable group. ISIS is a terrorist group that has unbelievable resources. Where do they get millions and millions of dollars a day? And the rest of the free world cannot just sit and say, well, let's see what happens in 3 to 6 months, because there are 30,000, could be 50. There are not 30,000 Al-Qaeda members out there. There are 31,000 soldiers fighting for ISIS. But you're right. Could we annihilate them? In a minute. But we have to do it. You've got to take decisive action. Leadership says, make a decision, but he's got to change his narrative for the Middle East. And I don't think the president wants to do it. We point that out in the book.
Well, I mean, American people, you feel paralyzed. What are we going to do?
I think 3 things have to happen. Number 1, we really have to, you said it, Pat, we've got to decimate them.
Yes.
They have to be crushed. They have to be stopped. So we have to do everything we can, which means don't get the UN in there meddling in the middle of this. Let's not get sidetracked on issues that don't matter. This issue matters. Crush them. So it's got to be singular focus, which this president has not been very good at.
He doesn't like victory at war.
Right, he does not. So he doesn't like war. Number 2, the narrative, he's got to change his narrative. His narrative didn't work. Change it. And that narrative is, this is a threat to eliminate. We know we have the military power to do it. We have to use it. And the president doesn't want to be a war president, but that's the leadership role. The mantle is passed to him. Act like a president. Act like a commander-in-chief.
If he's got the Levant, he's going to try to take over Jordan, Israel, of course, Iraq, Egypt. He'll want the whole thing. He wants
march right into Saudi Arabia too, and they're playing both sides against every side of this. So, and that has to stop. Also, that's another one of the things that we can do. Our allies in the region, Qatar, really, if they're an ally, stop funding ISIS. Saudi Arabia, stop funding these groups. They can do it. It's going to take American leadership. We don't have that right now, but we're going to have to insist on it.
Well, this will shock you, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe it won't shock you, but at least it'll give you something to talk about. It's the rise of ISIS, and this is available on CBN.com. It's available on Amazon and wherever books are sold.
Barnes & Noble and Apple iBooks.
I hope it does well. God bless you.
Thank you, Pat.
Jay Sekulow, ladies and gentlemen.